So joining us today from Edmonton Community Foundation is Craig Stump-Fallon. Craig is the Director of Grants and Community Engagement at ECF. He joined ECF in 2005 as the Scholarships Officer and is now overseeing all of ECF's granting activities. Craig started in Edmonton's nonprofit sector at the Citadel Theatre and has since worked in the arts, environmental, and social services sectors. He has served on several committees and boards, including the Pride Centre of Edmonton, Eco City Edmonton Grants, Edmonton Arts Council, Edmonton Chamber of Voluntary Organizations, and the City of Edmonton. Craig is also a cook, canner, gardener, arts lover, and traveler. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks, Chantel. Thanks, everyone, too, for registering. It's a little intimidating to realize I'm talking to so many people. I hope that each of you will find at least something from this that you can take away and hopefully have more success in applying for grants. So I'm going to just start with a brief introduction to Edmonton Community Foundation. Community foundations have a geographic mandate, which means that we serve our specific community. There's about a dozen now in Alberta, in Grand Prairie, Medicine Hat, Calgary, Banff, Canmore, and most recently in Wood Buffalo. They just started this year. Each community foundation has local leadership, many donors, and we grant broadly across all sectors. And we use an endowment model, which means that donors contribute to permanent endowments, which have certain purposes, and we give away the income each year. So it's meant to be a nice steady flow out into the community instead of the fluctuating grant amounts that other funding streams have. I will say that we are governed by the Income Tax Act and the Canada Revenue Agency. So we can only grant to registered charities. Well, that's actually not quite true. We grant to what CRA calls qualified donnees, which primarily means registered charities, but also includes some other groups such as municipalities and some First Nations. So I should say that most of you are looking at the list of who's participating. Most of you are not eligible to apply to Edmonton Community Foundation. And so I'll be speaking generically about funding, not specific to Edmonton Community Foundation. And I would encourage you, if you have questions about applying specifically to ECF, that you contact me afterwards. And, okay, now I know how to change the slides. That's good. Chantel's already told you a bit about me. I'll just say that I've served on a number of grants committees with other funders. So like I said before, I'm working in this context to provide you with generic tips, not focused on ECF. I haven't been as involved with government funders, and sometimes provincial or federal governments can be much more stringent. It varies from program to program, but they can be much more stringent as to their requirements. But in my experience, most funders, for most funders, you'd find the tips that I'm going to provide valuable. For those of you who are working in the nonprofit sector, it might go without saying that grants are only one piece of a sound financial strategy. Usually grants are tied to a specific program or need, which means that your hands are a bit tied when you receive a grant. Other sources of funding like fundraisers and donations and social enterprise provide you with income that you can use more broadly to meet your other needs. The other thing about grants is that they're often one time, which means that as great as it is to get a grant, it isn't necessarily the be-all and end-all of your financial security problems. And unfortunately, there's no secret when it comes to applying for grants. If you're hoping to learn the secret handshake which will unlock grants for you, I'm going to disappoint you. But there are tips, and so I will move into those. I will try to watch the chat box for questions, and if I miss those, I apologize, but I'll try to answer them as we go. So the first step is to make sure that your organization is strong as possible. Obviously, you want to provide good programming. It's also important that you can communicate your impact. So tell the difference that you are making, and I will come back to that a bit later on as well. But you need to be the best you can be in order to convince others of that as well. One way to do that is to connect with broader sector organizations who can help you improve your organization. So they can help you develop strategic plans, do board development, improve your financial management. All of that will help you do your work better and demonstrate your capacity to a funder. So most people who go into the nonprofit sector go into it because of their passion for the programming. But it's also important to think about those other underlying foundational expectations that a funder might have about who they want to support. It's also good to connect with others who are doing similar work. It's important to understand how your work fits into the spectrum of services in your community, both so that you can better serve your clients or participants, for example, through cross-referral. Oh, we can't help you, but that organization can, but also so that you can develop partnerships or collaborations. At ECF, we often see people apply, and we ask a question specifically about how you fit into the spectrum of services. And what we hear is that the organization is unique. And that's great. Obviously, you don't want to be duplicating what everyone else is doing, but it's also important to understand how you fit into that spectrum, both so that you can make sure that you're being effective and efficient, but also so that you can communicate how you, as a group, improve your community. The next bullet, make sure that you're eligible, should seem pretty obvious, but read the website, talk to someone if you can, understand the criteria, the limitations, and the priorities of the grant program that you're applying to. So as an example, a colleague asked me to review a grant application that she'd written. She'd done a lot of work on it. In about 2 minutes, I'd realized that she wasn't eligible because the program that she was applying to was for Indigenous organizations, and she ran an Indigenous program in a mainstream organization. And so when she looked into it, it turned out that she'd done all that work for nothing. So take the time to make sure you're eligible before you go through the work. It's also important to give yourself time to write an application. It takes time to put together a coherent argument. It takes time to collect any attachments that they might request, like financial statements, board lists, and so on. Although usually the same requirements, as far as those attachments go, would be most grant programs will ask for the same thing, so keep those handy. It also takes time to proofread it, or better yet, get someone else to proofread your application, especially if you're new at it, at writing grants. It's important that you have an external lens to make sure that you are writing in a way that people who aren't involved in your program from day to day can understand what you're doing and what you're needing. I hate to say it, but spelling and grammar are important. So another reason to proofread or get someone else to proofread your application. For better or for worse, spelling and grammar can help make your application that much more coherent. This is a minor point, but at ECF, we often get applications from organizations who are applying to the GEF, the Greater Edmonton Foundation, which is a completely different organization with an unfortunately similar name. Make sure that you're addressing your application to the right people. If you can, certainly apply on time, and if you can, apply early. At ECF, if you apply early and we have questions or something is missing, we can come back to you. If you apply right at the deadline, we frankly don't have the time for that. So it's good to apply early if you can, but certainly apply on time. Remember that there can be technical issues, especially with online applications or printers or such, and not all grantors can be forgiving about your delays, so don't miss the deadlines. And it's also important to understand the timeline for a decision. If you applied today to Edmonton Community Foundation, you would get a decision in February for funding after March 1st. Like most funders, ECF does not provide retroactive funding. So if your program was starting next week, you'd have to understand in applying to us that we wouldn't consider that funding because it would be before the decision would be made. And then the other thing to do before you apply, if you can, is to volunteer on a grants committee. A lot of people in the sector who write grants and then sit on a committee to review grants comment on how much they've learned through that process. You'll start to recognize what makes an application stronger or what is a gap in an application. Even if it's not a grants committee related to your specific area, it can really provide you with some great insight as to what to look for or in your own applications. Moving on to when you're applying. Remember your audience. Who's going to be assessing your application? Make sure that it's addressed appropriately and to their level of knowledge. So if you're applying for a food security program and you're applying to a grants program which is specifically about food security, hopefully the people reviewing that will have more of a background in that issue. If you're applying to something more generic, you might need to be providing more background as to what the need is and how your program fits into serving that or addressing that need. So make sure that you don't use jargon that the reviewers shouldn't be expected to know, including abbreviations. The other thing about the audience is to make sure that you're addressing it appropriately as far as the messaging that you would use for an individual donor is probably going to be different from what you would use for a grantor. A donor often, the strongest way to promote, to put forward your argument is using heartstrings, right? Think of the messaging that you would see when it comes to a homeless shelter. They're going to talk about people, the cold weather, hunger, those sorts of issues. When you're writing to a grantor, they're going to want to focus more on your plan to address those issues. So you're going to have to get right into the meat and potatoes rather than using the heartstrings. Next, start with your end in mind, and by that I mean identify your goal and lay out your strategy to achieve it. The process is likely going to be competitive, so you have to think about how you can be persuasive. What's your case for support? How is your program going to benefit your community? You might want to include research about the field. You might want to include mention of best practices, examples of other programs, say in another province that you are importing and how they've been effective there and how you're customizing it for your community. You might want to show the benefit that you're already bringing if this is an ongoing program. It's important to think about how you're going to demonstrate your success here. So what evidence do you have that you can, or what evidence will you get that your program is making a difference? It's important to understand the difference between outputs and outcomes when it comes to this. Funders will often ask you to indicate what outcomes you'll be measuring to demonstrate your effectiveness. Now, outcomes and outputs are different. Outputs are the things that you're actually doing. So how many clients you serve, how many hours of programming you provide, those kinds of things. Outcomes are the difference that you're actually making. So it might be a survey that demonstrates that people feel more knowledgeable about an issue or feel more supported by their community or know where to go when there's a need, or you've connected them to resources, this number of people. And those outcomes could be qualitative or quantitative, ideally both. Quantitative are great because it shows you the scale of what you're doing from the perspective of pure measurement. Qualitative, those stories about the kinds of impacts you have on individuals are also important. Next, make sure that your ask is realistic, both for your organization and your funder. Does the application make sense based on the application process, the match of the program to the funder's interests, the amount available, etc.? And make sure you don't chase the money. If you're running a physical activity program and now there's a funding stream for tobacco cessation, make sure that that makes sense for your organization. Don't apply just because the funding is available, because like I said, grants are usually one time, and so you're going to end up creating this program which you might not be able to sustain, but you might. I've seen more than one organization start a program in that kind of a situation, and then the funding ends and they keep the program going and they're scrambling to keep it going. So don't chase the money. Make sure it makes sense for your organization. Follow all the application guidelines. That should be obvious. If you have questions, ask, and make sure you listen to the feedback, because each funder is an expert in their own funding program and should be able to give you good guidance as to what might be effective or what probably wouldn't be. It's important, of course, to be clear what you are requesting and why. I personally think the strongest requests start with the request up front. Don't leave us wondering. I get through too many applications where I'm not quite sure how much they're requesting. I'm not sure what they plan to do with the money if they get it. So make sure that right up front you say, I'm requesting $23,000 in order to implement this program, which will make these things. And then, of course, the rest of the application will expand on that, but put it right up front. And also be concise. Funders see lots of applications and appreciate the ones that are concise and not repetitive. So make sure that you're saying things that you need to say. Don't fill in space just because you think more words will be more effective. In my experience, that's not the case. It can be very impactful to include pictures, charts, or graphs if the formatting of the application allows that. Not all of them do. But you know, different reviewers will learn in different ways. So if you can provide the same information in different formats, that can be strong. And then finally, letters of support can add a lot of heft to your request by showing external support. They should be specific to the program for which you are requesting funding. They should be current. And they should be from external partners or clients or others who can speak to the benefit of your program. Oddly, we've received some letters of support from board and staff of the applicant organization, and needless to say, that doesn't carry a lot of weight with us. We prefer to see that external parties can speak to that support. Now, I have a whole slide on budget, which I think underlines why the importance I think that a good budget has. It lays out what you have, what you need, and how a grant will help. So on the expenses side, It shows the funder what your actual expense lines are. It ideally will identify what lines the funders will support, or it will demonstrate where the gap is that they're filling in. So sometimes we'll see requests that say we need $33,000 for these budget lines. Other times we'll see we need $33,000 because our total project is $63 and we have 30 from someplace else and 33 is the remainder. It's good to have a clear connection between the budget and the request and then the amount being requested. On the revenue side, revenues show your strategy to support the remainder of the project if the grant won't cover the full cost. Make sure that your figures are reasonable. Don't undervalue or inflate. If reviewers are looking at numbers and saying, well, they can't do this project with the amount they've requested, or they're never going to get this cost covered for the amount they've put in there, that's a weakness. If they think that you're inflating, that's also a weakness. So try to make sure your budgets are reasonable. Try to show how you arrived at those figures. Sometimes notes at the bottom of the budget which explain larger costs or where they came from can be helpful. Sometimes breaking down, for example, staffing costs are often going to be the largest amount of any request. So providing a breakdown of those figures can be helpful. A balanced budget is always strongest. If you have a large surplus, it seems like you don't need a grant. And if you have a large deficit, it seems like you don't have a plan to fund the remainder of the project. So show a balanced budget. If on the revenue side, you might want to specify that certain lines are confirmed or pending, but it is good to show a balanced budget. And then include a fair amount for administration and evaluation. It's best, especially from the nonprofit perspective, to build this into every program so that you can start to piece together your administration budget, because it's very hard to find funds for pure administration. With regards to what is a fair amount, usually it's about 10 to 20%, but it really depends on your organization, because smaller organizations will usually have a larger percentage because they can't divide up administration costs between as many programs. It also depends on the grant guidelines. So sometimes grant guidelines will specify that they will only consider a certain percentage as part of a budget. Next, after you apply, it's a good idea to ask for feedback if you can. First of all, if you're declined, it's important to understand whether that no that you got is a no, not now, or no, not ever. Because if it's the latter, you know never to apply. But often people will get declined, and then, for example, at ECF, we'll never hear from them again, when it wasn't the case that we would never consider their request. It just was not successful that time. So talk to your funder and find out what feedback you can get. Find out what you did well, what you could do better, and find out when you can apply again, because if it's 6 months or a year, you should be penciling that into your calendar for the next time. Your funder might also be able to tell you about other funding opportunities, so make sure that you ask about that. It's good to maintain contact with a funder. First of all, if your plans change, talk to your funder first. There's that old saying about it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission, and I would say that on the funding side, that is not the case. If an organization's plans changed and they used funding from ECF in a way that we would never have approved, that would sour the relationship. Much better to say, hey, here's this situation. our needs have changed, or the community changed, or the program has to change for these reasons, and therefore, can we make this shift? Much better to say that, to ask that in advance. Also, invite your funder to events related to the funded program or your annual general meetings. Don't be surprised if they don't come, because we are all funding many different projects and programs, but if they can, then that's a great way to maintain a relationship. And it's a good opportunity for them to learn more about what they're supporting. And then finally, report back. This is an important part of maintaining your relationship with the funder. It's usually a requirement for the next grant. So make sure that you report as required. If it makes sense, include mention of where a grant leveraged other contributions from other funders, or it helped you develop partnerships, or it built your volunteer corps, or gained media attention. Those are all great things to tell a funder. If it didn't go well, tell your funder that too. Tell them what you learned through that process, and it might lead to another opportunity to work together, but certainly it does not go well if you don't tell the funder and then they find out later that you weren't honest with them. Many of you are with nonprofits, and I talked before about how ECF can only grant to registered charities. So I'm going to talk too about charities and intermediaries. And so just with regards to language, when I talk about a charity, I mean an agency that is registered with Canada Revenue Agency. When I talk about a non-charity or nonprofit, what I mean is usually a nonprofit that's registered provincially, but without that charitable status. And ECF's often asked to grant to a non-charity through a quote-unquote fiscal agent, which is the charity. And the short answer is no, we can't do that. Canada Revenue Agency says that a charity cannot act as a conduit and transfer funds to a non-charity without maintaining direction and control. But a charity can act through what is called an intermediary. So the non-charity delivers an activity on behalf of the charity. So it's the same kind of relationship, but a bit different. The charity has to maintain what CRA calls direction and control. The activity must be consistent with the charity's charitable purpose. And from CRA's perspective, the activity belongs to the charity. CRA recommends that the two parties have a written agreement. Usually it's only a couple of pages. I have seen much longer, but most commonly I see 2 pages. And it's basically a description of who has what roles and what responsibilities, what the time frames and deadlines are going to be, the mechanisms for the charity to monitor, supervise, and provide ongoing instruction, periodic transfers. So for example, charity will commonly say, here's 40% up front, 40% when you provide an interim report. And by you, I mean the non-charity provides an interim report to the charity, and 20% at the end, or some relationship like that. Who's going to do the reporting to the funders? That's important to lay out. A written agreement will also outline any administrative fees that the charity would be charging. And the non-charity is supposed to keep separate record keeping so that it's easy to track what happened to the money. So this kind of relationship has pros and cons for both sides. For the charity, there's risk, but there's also the opportunity to demonstrate a partnership. It allows them to further their mandate And it may increase the capacity of the charity by helping them build a collaboration, access new expertise, and demonstrate their impact to a funder. I mentioned that there's risk for the charity, and the risk is basically that if your charity gives money to a non-charity and then they do something that you should not be doing as a charity, it's your charitable status that's on the line. So it's important to have a real relationship in these kinds of situations. For the non-charity or the intermediary, there is a bit of loss of control, but there is the ability to access funds, the ability to complete the project that you're working on, and again, it may increase the capacity of your organization by supporting the development of collaboration, access to expertise, and demonstrating impact to funders. So look at that, I'm right on schedule. That's all I have to say. I have not seen any questions pop up in the chat box. But if you do have questions, you're welcome to ask those now or to reach out to me at your leisure.
Great, thank you so much, Craig, for that. We will just open the floor for questions. So if you do have a question, please feel free to type it into the chat box there. We'll just give a minute to see if anyone has any questions. If not, then we'll wrap up. All right, it looks to be pretty quiet, so we will go ahead and wrap up the session here. Again, Craig is available to answer any questions if you do have any regarding the session or anything related to the ECS grants. Again, Craig, thank you so much for doing the webinar today, and thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great